On CaribNation today, we will be discussing the Caribbean political system and the American political system. Stay tuned. We will be right back. This is CaribNation. I am Paul Nehru, Tennessee. Today, we will be discussing the differences and the similarities of the Caribbean political system with that of the United States of America. This is a very interesting subject because, as you are aware, in the United States, they have a president, they have a Congress, they have a Senate, and they perform very differently from the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, we have a prime minister, we have a cabinet, and we also have a parliament. In some parliaments, we have Senate also, but they fulfill different functions. Today in our studios, we have two eminent gentlemen who are going to lead this discussion about the differences between these two different political systems. It is very important in this time when we are talking about the free trade area of the Americas and standardizing a lot of things, where we are talking of becoming more and more similar to each other, that we begin to understand our differences and our similarities. In the studios today, we have the former ambassador of Barbados, Mr. Charles Keith, who is presently a consultant at the Inter-American Development Bank. And we also have with us today Professor John Kornacki, a professor at Johns Hopkins University, who would be discussing with us the American political system. Gentlemen, welcome to our program.
Thank you.
Now, Professor, I would like to start with you. Can you give us an idea, very simply, in a very synthesized way, what is the political system of the United States of America? How would you define it? Particularly focusing on the presidency, the Congress, and so forth.
One person put it, I think, eloquently as the great invitation to struggle. And because the four founders of this country, the United States it is, were so fearful of centralized authority, which they had with the King of England, that they decided the best way they could go about forming this new country of theirs was to try to separate out as much power as they could. And they did so, and they did it rather craftily with the help of people like James Madison. They created an executive branch, which was to carry out the executive powers, execute the laws, become president to become commander-in-chief of the armed forces when necessary. But a Congress to make the laws and to fund the programs that the president would carry out, and then just to make things even more confusing, and that is separate out things more, it evolved a Supreme Court that would kind of be a referee over them all and make sure things were played under the rules being the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution provides that great invitation to struggle. And by the way, mentioned first in that Constitution is the U.S. Congress.
So your Congress preceded your president.
Well,
you had a Congress before you had a president.
As James Madison once put it, he thought, and many of the founders thought, that the Congress would actually predominate in the execution of policy. What's happened over time, of course, you and I know is a little bit different. But it's not exactly what the founders had in mind, but they did, and we're exactly right about the separation issue, and that is, since it's a little vague as to who holds the higher cards, there's always a tension between the president and the Congress, and sometimes the courts, as to the functioning of this government of ours.
We're going to deepen that in the process of this program. Ambassador Keith, tell us a bit about the Caribbean political system. How did it evolve, and what do we really have there? How would you define the Caribbean political system?
Maybe I could best describe the difference between the two systems by pointing out that in the Caribbean, under the Caribbean system, which is the Westminster adapted, there's a single election.
Westminster means that it came from England, right?
From the model.
The British model.
The British model. There's a single election. There's an election for Parliament. Everything flows from that. The formation of the government, both in the sense that the majority parliament, the majority party in parliament is determined from that election, and who gets to form the executive branch. Whereas in the U.S. there are two separate elections. There is only one election under the Caribbean system, the Commonwealth Caribbean system. There is a single election.
So you don't have an election for prime minister and then an election for parliamentarian?
Absolutely not.
Everything is in one?
Right.
Uh-huh.
You elect, you make a choice between the contending parties, usually two, for reasons which I will not go into.
But do you have a president?
You can have a president under that system. In other words, you can choose to call the prime minister a president, but the system still operates.
No, but literally speaking, in Barbados, do you have a governor general or a president?
We have a governor general.
And this governor general represents who? The Queen of England?
The Queen of England.
But this is not true of all English-speaking Caribbeans. Some have presidents like Trinidad.
You can combine that system with a republic form of government in which the representative is not the representative of the Queen of England, but is merely the head of state.
A constitutional head. So it's a kind of symbolic head.
It's a symbol.
But the real power is in the hand of the prime minister.
But even under the system where the governor general is the Queen's representative, the head of state is still only symbolic.
Symbolic. But the prime minister, therefore, is the one that has executive power.
Absolutely. Under either form, the prime minister has the power.
Yeah. Well, I want to compare a bit. Let's move a bit. Ambassador Skeet says that the prime minister has executive power. And in your case, the Congress, in the case of the U.S. system, the president has executive power. But is it not true that your Congress has a lot of power, and some people even believe more power than your president? Can you talk about that a bit? What your Congress is like compared with your president?
It'd be a good idea to kind of review what those powers are, because we use them kind of loosely. Let's say the executive power is the power to execute laws, the power to carry out what's been codified. Who does the codifying? That's the legislative branch, the group that makes the laws. Now, I think an interesting difference here is that the group, as was mentioned by the ambassador, the group that makes the laws, the Congress, is split itself into two parts. One is the House of Representatives. They're elected every 2 years. Whole thing starts over for that. The Senate of the United States elected every 6 years. And, by the way, only a third of them are elected in every 6-year term. So the Senate, by nature, is a continuing body, of which only a third ever come up for election every 6 years.
But the Congress, which makes up both the Senate and these House of Representatives, they have not only legislative powers, they make policy too, don't they?
Well, what happens is they have the most important power, one of the most important powers they have, aside from making the laws, is the power of the purse. In other words, they fund everything. So the Congress has to approve the funding before a program can be carried out.
So what happens if a president is elected by a large amount of votes and he wants to carry out 20 programs and the Congress says no? Government stops?
Well, actually, you point out an interesting part of the way the American system works, and that is, generally, when a president comes in, we've got an election coming up, by the way, we'll see if this happens. If a president comes in with a mandate, that is an overwhelming victory, and brings with him or her a majority in the Congress. Now remember, the difference being, it doesn't matter if the president has a majority in the Congress or not. The president is elected separately. And oftentimes in the United States, we've had presidents of a different party than the Congress, as we do right now. But, for example, only, if a president comes in with a mandate, elected, and brings in his majority party of both branches with him, the chances are of that president having his legislative program passed is great. For example, that happened in 1932 when President Franklin Roosevelt won an overwhelming victory and also came in with a big Congress.
But has there been an example of the reverse, where they are a real obstacle to the president?
Well, an interesting election that points to some of the difficulty would be President Clinton's second term.